My wife cheated with an art dealer for several years and acted calmly. When I was collecting evidence, I met a mysterious woman, and then skyscrapers stretched across the horizon, their mirrored facades glinting in the sunlight like shards of crystal in a champagne glass. They were monuments of steel and glass that I'd spent the last 2 decades stacking up. From nothing, I'd built an empire, a city, and an entire skyline that lay beneath my gaze, almost as if bowing to me in reverence. The view from my office on the top floor was something most people could only dream about. In fact, it was the kind of place I had once only dreamed about myself. Now, here I was, Jackson Hayes, 42 years old and supposedly at the top of the world. I had it all: money, power, and influence. A high-rise office in New York City with panoramic views, a sleek penthouse on the Upper East Side, and the admiration of many who wished to be in my shoes. My name was respected, if not feared, in the real estate world, and I'd earned every ounce of it with grit and relentless ambition. And then there was Amelia. Amelia. My wife of 10 years, the one constant in this journey from rags to riches. Amelia and I had met in the city when she was still working as a marketing director for a luxury brand. Back then, she was the woman everyone wanted. Long, dark hair that cascaded like a river down her back, eyes that could cut through granite, and a wit that left men fumbling for words. She was a jewel, a trophy, but more than that, she was my partner. She was my world. But lately, that world felt unsteady. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Maybe it was the way she had started dressing up, even when she was supposedly just going to meet with the girls or do some shopping on Madison Avenue. Or maybe it was the way she'd begun avoiding eye contact, slipping past me with vague excuses, her phone glued to her hand as though it held all the secrets of the universe. Whatever it was, I knew something had changed. One night, I decided to wait up for her. It was almost midnight when I heard the door click open and her heels against the marble foyer. She walked in, an intoxicating scent trailing behind her. It was an expensive perfume, one I didn't recognize. I knew her scents like I knew my own. She wore the same French brands, the kind that lingered and filled a room, making heads turn. But this was different, a little too exotic, too bold. It didn't suit her. Or rather, it didn't suit the Amelia I knew. She slipped off her shoes and looked up, surprised to see me awake. I watched her, searching her eyes for answers, but she merely offered a half smile and moved past me. Something in me twisted, and I knew then that I couldn't just sit around, waiting for answers that might never come. The next morning, as I sat in my office, the usual morning rush of meetings and emails failed to distract me from the gnawing sense of unease. Amelia had never given me any reason to doubt her before, but now I was questioning everything. And so, I made a decision. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I picked up my phone and dialed an old acquaintance, a private investigator named Lucas Ford. Lucas and I had crossed paths years ago during a messy merger, and I knew he was discreet and capable. If there was something to be found, he'd find it. Jackson Hayes, Lucas greeted, his voice smooth and practiced. I take it you're not calling for a social chat? I cut straight to the point. I need you to follow my wife, Lucas. Something's off, and I can't put my finger on it. There was a pause on the other end, but Lucas wasn't one to question a paycheck. Consider it done. Send me the details, and I'll get started. You'll have a report by the end of the week. With that, I set the wheels in motion. I had no idea what Lucas would uncover, but I knew it wouldn't be pretty. I leaned back in my leather chair, looking out at the city that had once been my only love. Now, it seemed to mock me, as if whispering secrets I wasn't yet privy to. The following days were a blur. Lucas worked fast, as he always did, and by Thursday, he had a full report ready. He called me into his nondescript office downtown, a far cry from my towering fortress in the sky. I entered the cramped room and saw him sitting behind his desk, a thick folder in his hands. He looked up, his expression neutral but his eyes serious. "It's not what you're expecting," he said, sliding the folder across the desk. My hands trembled as I opened it, my mind racing with possibilities. What could Amelia be hiding? Was it another man? Had she fallen out of love with me? As I flipped through the photographs and read the detailed notes, I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The report documented Amelia's days, her frequent visits to a specific address on Fifth Avenue. She had been meeting with someone, a man named Ethan Rivera, who worked as an art dealer. He was tall, with a distinct European flair, the kind of guy you'd expect to find in a French cafe, not in the bustling streets of New York. The notes went on to describe how they'd meet at art galleries, slip into side alleys, and visit upscale restaurants where they'd linger over wine and whispered conversations. But then, the report took a turn. Amelia wasn't just seeing Ethan. She had been funneling money into a joint account under a different name. Her face was captured on security footage at a local bank, looking over her shoulder as she made withdrawals. It wasn't just a simple affair. It was something more. Something much darker. "She's been transferring funds from your accounts to this shared one," Lucas explained, pointing to a series of transactions. "She's siphoned off a considerable amount, and from what I can tell, she's planning to leave." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. This was more than betrayal. It was an intricate web of lies that had been spun right under my nose. And as I sat there, staring at the evidence of her deception, I knew this was only the beginning. If Amelia was capable of this, what else had she been hiding? The answer wouldn't come easy, but I was determined to find it. Whatever it took, I'd uncover the truth, and I wouldn't rest until I'd unraveled every last thread of the life we'd built together. The facts were clear. Amelia had betrayed me, and Ethan Rivera was not just a passing fling. He was something much darker, something tangled in webs that stretched far beyond a sordid affair. As the shock settled into a steely resolve, I knew I couldn't just sit back and watch. No, I had to dig deeper, and to do that, I needed someone with skills that reached beyond my own. My right-hand man, Noah Blackwell, was the obvious choice. A former CIA agent, Noah had been by my side for nearly a decade, helping me navigate some of the most treacherous deals in the real estate world. He was a man of few words, with a talent for making problems disappear. If anyone could unearth the secrets hidden beneath Amelia's betrayal, it was him. I called him into my office early the next morning, well before the city stirred to life. He arrived, as always, in a tailored suit that somehow still managed to look understated. His piercing gaze met mine as he took a seat across from me, the sun casting shadows on the sleek glass table between us. "Noah, I need you to dig," I said, cutting straight to the point. "Ethan Rivera isn't just an art dealer, and Amelia, well, she's tangled in something far more serious than I initially thought." Noah's expression didn't change. He'd seen worse. "Give me all the details," he replied, pulling out a notebook, ready to scribble down anything I could give him. I told him everything Lucas had uncovered. The secret bank accounts, the meetings, the transfers. I watched as he nodded, already formulating a plan. Noah had a way of thinking 3 steps ahead, seeing connections where others saw only chaos. "I'll need access to your financial records," he said, snapping his notebook shut. "If she's been moving money, I can trace the transfers and see where they lead. I also need details on Rivera, where he lives, his routine, any known associates. If he's part of something bigger, he's bound to have left a trail." Over the next few days, Noah worked tirelessly, peeling back layers of Amelia's deceit with precision. He hacked into bank records, bypassed firewalls, and sifted through transaction histories with the kind of expertise that only someone from the CIA could possess. His methods were unorthodox, to say the least. He used a secure laptop, one he'd rigged himself, and routed through multiple proxy servers to avoid detection. I watched in awe as he pulled up encrypted records, cracking codes with ease and bringing up data that would have taken ordinary people months to uncover. One evening, he called me over to his office, a modest setup he maintained near the East River, well away from prying eyes. "I've got something," he said, gesturing for me to sit as he brought up a map on his computer. Noah pointed to a location near Brooklyn, a small gallery that Rivera frequented. "It's a front," he explained. "Rivera and his crew are using art sales to launder money. The transactions are all masked as legitimate purchases, but when you trace the origins, it's all bogus. Shell companies, fake buyers, and inflated appraisals. The artwork is just a vehicle to move cash." He zoomed in on another point on the map, this time an upscale condo building in Tribeca. "Amelia's been meeting Rivera here, but she's not just a bystander. She's moving funds through offshore accounts linked to this operation. Rivera's crew has their hooks in her because of old debts. She's essentially their financial mule. The revelation hit me like a slap to the face. Amelia, the woman I trusted with everything, had been reduced to a pawn in a dirty game. And it wasn't just any game. It was one that could ruin lives and destroy everything I'd built. I clenched my fists, feeling a surge of anger, but Noah interrupted my thoughts. If you want to bring Rivera down, you're going to need more than just me, he said. This guy has connections in the underground. He's not operating alone, and he's protected by people who won't think twice about taking you out if you step on their toes. What do you suggest? I asked, my mind already racing. Noah leaned back, crossing his arms. There's someone you need to meet. Her name's Isabella Stone. She's cunning, powerful, and has her own network of informants that go deep into the city's underbelly. She deals in favors and information. Exactly the kind of person who could get us into Rivera's circle. But she won't come cheap. I'd heard of Isabella Stone before. She was somewhat of a legend in the city's darker circles, a woman with ties to everyone from underground casinos in Atlantic City to backroom deals in Miami. Rumor had it she'd been born into a family of grifters, but had carved her own path, building a reputation that even the toughest men in the business respected. Set it up, I replied, barely hesitating. I want to meet her. Noah wasted no time. Within hours, he'd arranged a meeting with Isabella at an upscale lounge in Soho, a place so exclusive it didn't even have a name. I arrived late that night, the streets buzzing with nightlife, but the lounge itself was quiet, an oasis of calm. The interior was dimly lit, with dark leather booths and an aura of secrecy that seemed to cling to the air. Isabella was waiting for me at a table in the corner, a glass of red wine in hand. She was as stunning as they said, tall and elegant, with sharp features and an air of authority that made you think twice before crossing her. Her long black hair was pulled back, and she wore a fitted dress that seemed to shimmer under the muted lights. Mr. Hayes, she greeted me with a smile, her voice smooth as silk. Noah speaks highly of you. I took a seat across from her, watching her closely. I need your help to bring down Ethan Rivera, I said, wasting no time. And I hear you're the best person for the job. Isabella raised an eyebrow, a glint of amusement in her eyes. Rivera? You've chosen quite the target. He's got friends in places you don't want to go, but he's also been making a lot of enemies lately. Seems he's not as loyal as he'd like people to believe. She took a sip of her wine, studying me over the rim of the glass. I can get you access to his network. I know people who know people, but it's going to cost you. Money isn't an issue, I replied, leaning forward. Name your price. She smirked, setting down her glass. It's not money I'm after, Mr. Hayes. What I want is a favor. A promise that when the time comes, you'll return it, no questions asked. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and I knew this was her game. Isabella was a master manipulator, but I was willing to play along if it meant getting closer to Rivera. Consider it done, I said, sealing the deal with a nod. Isabella nodded, satisfied. Very well. I'll arrange for you to attend one of Rivera's gatherings. He throws these little soirees every month or so for his buyers and associates, usually in one of those hidden lofts in Chelsea. It's all hush-hush, invitation only. I can get you in, but you'll need a cover. She pulled a sleek, metallic card from her purse and slid it across the table. Use this. It's an invitation for someone else, but I doubt he'll be showing up anytime soon. Dress sharp, blend in, and keep your mouth shut. Rivera's people are sharp, and if they suspect you, it'll be over before it begins. I picked up the card, feeling the weight of the situation settle over me. Isabella stood up, adjusting her dress as she prepared to leave. Oh, and Jackson, she said, pausing to look back at me. Watch your back. In Rivera's world, trust is a rare commodity. Don't expect anyone to have your best interests at heart. With that, she disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I looked down at the metallic card in my hand, the key to a world I'd never imagined entering. The road ahead was dangerous, filled with unknowns and traps, but I was prepared to face it. Amelia, Rivera, and this whole twisted scheme, I'd bring it all crashing down, no matter the cost. The night felt different. A chill had settled over the city, unusual for early fall, as if the atmosphere itself was in on a secret that I hadn't quite uncovered yet. I paced the length of my office, the rhythm of my footsteps lost in the thick carpet beneath me, thinking through the maze that was Amelia's deception. I had been doing my best to keep everything together, my company, my sanity, but the deeper I dug, the more I felt the ground shifting under my feet. That evening, I'd called Noah over. We were meant to go over the new information he'd uncovered about Ethan and the murky world he was tangled in. But Noah had something else on his mind, something that wasn't part of the plan. He walked in, his expression unusually grim, and tossed a file onto my desk without a word. I opened it, my fingers thumbing through the pages. I recognized some of the names, connections to Ethan I'd already known about, the usual suspects from his criminal dealings. But then, midway through the stack, a photograph stopped me cold. It was a shot of Amelia, blurry but unmistakable, standing outside a seedy-looking club in East Harlem, flanked by two men I didn't recognize. One of them was younger, scrappy, with a face that looked like it had seen one too many bar fights. The other was older, a towering figure with a scar across his cheek, the kind of man you'd avoid at all costs if you saw him in an alley. "What is this?" I asked, looking up at Noah, my voice sounding almost foreign to my own ears. "This," he replied, his voice steady, "is what she's been doing on the nights she says she's out with friends." I felt a strange sense of detachment as I looked back at the photograph. Amelia had always been the social type, the kind of person who thrived in the spotlight. But this was something else entirely. My mind raced, trying to piece together the significance of the image, to figure out what my wife was doing in a place like that, with men like those. The question hung there, heavy, and I knew I wasn't going to like the answer. "She's not just tangled up with Ethan," Noah continued, crossing his arms. "She's meeting with low-level thugs, Jackson. Men who have histories, violent histories. These are the types who do the dirty work, the ones who don't mind getting their hands bloody if it means a quick payday." It hit me then that Amelia wasn't merely brushing up against the dark underworld Ethan inhabited. She was diving headfirst into it, mingling with people I wouldn't want to meet even with an army of bodyguards around me. There was a fine line between curiosity and desperation, and it was becoming painfully clear which side she'd chosen. "Do we know what they're planning?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could feel the tension coiling in my chest. "Not yet," Noah replied, shaking his head, "but I've got people working on it. I've tracked her movements over the last few weeks, and she's been making a lot of stops around East Harlem and the Bronx, places connected to known players in Ethan's network." I stared at the photograph again, and for a moment, the reality of the situation seemed to ripple around me. Amelia, the woman I'd built a life with, was not just tangled in some affair. She was involved in something far more sinister, something that was unfolding right in front of me, yet somehow remained just out of reach. It was like trying to see through fog. The outlines were there, but the details remained maddeningly elusive. A sudden, sharp thought pierced through my contemplation. I couldn't just sit back and wait for Noah's leads to bear fruit. I had to confront her, find out what she was doing with these men, why she was risking everything we'd built. The image of her standing next to those men, her face turned away from the camera, wouldn't leave my mind. It felt like a betrayal so blatant it was almost laughable, but it also felt like a cry for help, a strange contradiction that only deepened the pit forming in my stomach. "Set up surveillance on them," I said, finally breaking the silence. "I want to know every move they make. If Amelia is in deeper than we thought, then we need to pull her out before this spirals any further out of control." We spent the next hour going over the logistics, setting up plans to monitor Amelia's every move, to dig deeper into her connections, her motivations. But as I sat there, listening to Noah lay out the specifics, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only scratching the surface. There was more to this, a hidden layer that Amelia had yet to reveal, and I knew I wouldn't rest until I'd uncovered every last piece. I plunged headfirst into the underworld, a place I'd only heard about in hushed whispers over scotch at elite clubs or caught fleeting glimpses of in headlines. But now, it was all too real, and I was wading into it with purpose. Ethan Rivera wasn't just some shadowy art dealer. He was the tip of a much larger iceberg, one that threatened to take me down if I wasn't careful. To unravel Ethan's web, I needed people who lived in the underworld, people who spoke its language. Isabella had given me a list of names, contacts she vouched for, but who came with their own risks. She'd arranged meetings in gritty, dimly lit bars and hidden lounges across Manhattan, places I'd never dreamed of stepping into. The first was with Miguel "Mikey" Alvarez, an information broker based in Hell's Kitchen. Mikey wasn't just a rumor monger. He was practically a human encyclopedia on the city's most sordid dealings. Mikey operated out of a rundown office above a deli on 10th Avenue. The place smelled of stale pastrami and cigar smoke, and Mikey greeted me with a broad grin, revealing a gold tooth that glinted in the sparse light. He was a short, wiry man with tattoos snaking up his neck and arms, a veritable map of his life's journey, each inked line telling a story I probably didn't want to know. "Jackson Hayes," he said, dragging out my name like it was a surprise. "Didn't think I'd ever see a guy like you down here. What brings you to my corner of the world?" "Ethan Rivera," I replied, crossing my arms and meeting his gaze. "I need to know everything about him. His connections, his business, and, more importantly, who he's working with." Mikey leaned back, tapping a thick file on his desk. "Rivera? Huh? That guy's got his fingers in pies all over the place. You'd be surprised how many people in this city owe him favors. He runs with a crowd that makes Wall Street look like a church picnic." He opened the file and slid a series of photos toward me. "These are his associates," he continued, pointing to each face. "Marco Valenti, his second in command. The guy's Italian, slick, and deadly. Then there's Sarah Leong, his money launderer. She handles the cash and makes it disappear into thin air. They've got operations running from here to Chicago, maybe even further. And your wife." His voice trailed off as he picked up another photo, showing Amelia at some event with Ethan's crew. She looked poised and confident, every inch the woman I thought I knew, but now painted in a new, sinister light. Amelia's more than just a pawn, Hayes. She's helping them pull off some of their biggest scams. Financial fraud, mostly. They've got this scheme where they funnel investments into phony art projects, then siphon off the funds before anyone realizes it's a ghost operation. She's the one greasing the wheels, making sure the cash flows smoothly. The realization hit hard. Amelia wasn't just caught up in this mess. She was a willing participant. She had a hand in the very scams that were bankrolling Ethan's operation. I felt the bile rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down, keeping my composure in front of Mikey. I needed him on my side, at least for now. We worked out an arrangement. Mikey would feed me intel on Ethan's operations, and in return, I'd pay him handsomely. It wasn't cheap, but then again, nothing in this world was. A few days later, I was scheduled to meet with another contact, a man named Victor Zhang, who ran a gambling den in the basement of a Chinatown restaurant. Victor was a different breed, calm and calculating. A man who spoke little, but whose words carried weight. I met him late at night, well past midnight, when the city was quieter and the shadows stretched longer. Victor poured us tea, a gesture that felt oddly respectful given the nature of our business. "You're looking to take down Rivera?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's not an easy task. He has allies in places you might not expect. Judges, lawyers, even a few cops. You go after him, you'll be stirring up a nest of vipers." "I'm prepared," I replied, sipping the tea, which tasted bitter and earthy. "I need people who can get me inside. People who can give me leverage." Victor nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. "I can help with that. I know a few people who have scores to settle with Rivera. But be careful. Betrayals come easy in this line of work." We hashed out a plan, one that would take me deeper into the underworld than I'd ever imagined. I would have to make deals with people I'd ordinarily avoid, people who lived in the shadows and dealt in secrets and schemes. But I was ready, or so I thought. Days turned into weeks as I pieced together information, gathering details on Ethan's operations and Amelia's role within them. I was often meeting with Victor or Mikey, listening to their leads, chasing down every thread until it started to make a pattern. Amelia's financial influence stretched further than I'd realized. She wasn't just a pawn. She was a critical piece on the board, helping Ethan orchestrate large-scale frauds, investment schemes that pulled millions from unsuspecting investors. One afternoon, as I sat with Noah going over the latest intel, the world seemed to stop. We were in a small cafe in Tribeca, my usual haunt, where the noise of the city was a comforting backdrop to our tense discussions. Noah was updating me on a new lead, a high-profile investor who had been scammed by Ethan's crew when his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his brow furrowing. "I've got to take care of something," he said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "I'll be back in an hour." I watched him leave, unaware that it would be the last time I'd see him that day. An hour passed, then two, and as the afternoon turned into evening, I felt a knot of worry begin to form. I tried calling him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. It was past 9 when I received the call. An unknown number, which I answered with a mix of hope and dread. "Mr. Hayes?" The voice on the other end was rough, and I could hear muffled sounds in the background. "We've got your man. He's safe, for now. But he's got something we want, and if you want to see him again, you'll stay out of our business." The line went dead, leaving me with nothing but the cold realization that Noah had been taken. I felt a surge of anger, a fury that seemed to tighten every muscle in my body. They had him, and I knew exactly who they were. Ethan's people, no doubt. They'd caught wind of our plans and decided to send a message. 2 days later, Noah reappeared. He stumbled into my office early in the morning, his face bruised, his eyes bloodshot. He didn't speak, but the pain in his gaze told me everything I needed to know. They'd roughed him up, tried to get him to talk, but Noah was too loyal, too steadfast to give them anything. "They didn't get a damn word out of me," he said finally, sinking into the chair across from me. "But they know we're onto them, and they'll be watching, waiting for us to slip." I felt a surge of pride and guilt in equal measure. Noah had put himself on the line for me, and now we were both in deeper than ever. But this only steeled my resolve. I was angry, yes, but more than that, I was determined. Ethan Rivera and his cronies had made their move, and now it was my turn. The next steps would be dangerous. I knew that, but I also knew I couldn't stop now. I was too far in, and if I turned back, I'd lose everything. Amelia had made her choices, and now I was making mine. Whatever it took, I would bring Ethan down, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of his empire but ashes. Noah's kidnapping had raised the stakes, and I was prepared to go all the way. The path ahead was treacherous, but I had allies, people who had just as much reason to see Rivera fall as I did. I'd align myself with them, use their resources, and play the game by their rules, if that's what it took. And in the end, when the dust settled, I'd make sure everyone who had wronged me was left to face the consequences of their actions. It was only a few days after Noah's return from his brutal abduction that he took matters into his own hands. He was a man of resilience, someone who didn't wait around for the tides to shift in his favor. While I focused on shoring up my company and keeping a close watch on Amelia's plans to escape, Noah had already begun hunting down the men who had ambushed him. This wasn't just about the investigation anymore. For Noah, it had become personal. I could tell by the look in his eyes that morning. He stepped into my office with a steely resolve, his usually composed demeanor now edged with a quiet fury. He hadn't mentioned anything about tracking down his captors. He had simply gone silent on the topic since his return. But that morning, he looked at me with a fierce intensity, and I knew something had changed. "They tried to break me," he said, his voice low but charged with anger. "Now, it's time they pay for it." He didn't need my permission or approval, but I nodded, knowing that Noah was the kind of man who wouldn't rest until he'd exacted his own form of justice. I watched him leave my office, a man on a mission, and I knew I wouldn't hear from him until he'd finished what he'd set out to do. 2 days passed without a word. I carried on, trying to piece together the shattered remains of my company. The information Noah had gathered about Amelia's exit plan haunted my every waking moment. Fake passports, offshore accounts, and a luxury penthouse in Madrid. She was planning to vanish, and if she succeeded, she'd leave me with nothing. But as much as I tried to focus, part of my mind kept drifting back to Noah. I wondered where he was, what he was doing, and if he was safe. On the third day, I received a call. It was early, the city barely stirring awake, and Noah's voice crackled through the phone, rough and low. "It's done," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "I found them, and they won't be bothering us again." He didn't offer details, but I needed to know. I drove out to his place in Queens, a modest brownstone tucked away on a quiet street. When I arrived, he was sitting on the steps, a cigarette dangling from his fingers, his eyes distant. "What happened?" I asked, sitting down beside him. He took a long drag, exhaling slowly before he began. "I traced them to a warehouse in Red Hook. They weren't expecting me, and they definitely weren't prepared for what I brought with me." I could picture it, the dimly lit warehouse, the heavy silence broken only by the echo of footsteps. Noah had always been good at finding people who didn't want to be found, and I knew he'd approach them with the same precision and calculation he brought to every mission. "They thought they'd covered their tracks," he continued, a slight smirk on his face. "But I left them a little present before I left the first time. A small tracker in my watch." He patted his wrist where his watch usually Saturday. "They took it from me, but I'd already set it to send me their location. Once I knew where they were, it was just a matter of time." He went on to describe how he'd slipped into the warehouse undetected, moving through the shadows like a ghost. He'd found the men in the back, laughing and joking as if they hadn't just held him captive days before. He described the flash of surprise on their faces when he stepped into the light, and then the look of terror when they realized who he was. "It wasn't about the pain," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was about making sure they knew they'd made a mistake. I didn't give them the courtesy of a quick end. I made sure they understood exactly who they'd crossed." As he spoke, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Noah wasn't just efficient, he was ruthless. I'd seen him operate before, but this was different. This was personal. He'd taken his time, calculated every move, and left no room for mercy. "I left them there," he said finally, flicking the cigarette, "but into the street. By the time anyone finds them, it'll be too late. They're nothing but a message now, a warning for anyone else who thinks they can cross us." I nodded, understanding the gravity of what he'd done. Noah had taken care of the problem, but in doing so, he'd drawn a line in the sand. This was more than just revenge. It was a declaration that we weren't going to back down. Not now, not ever. As I drove back to the city, my mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. Amelia was still out there, planning her escape, and I had no doubt that she'd stop at nothing to see it through. But with Noah by my side, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. We were in this together, and we wouldn't rest until we'd unraveled every last thread of her deceit. It was later that day that I received a call from Detective Burke. He'd been working behind the scenes, pulling together evidence, building a case that would not only bring down Ethan but expose everyone involved. He'd set up a meeting at a small office on the outskirts of town, a place he'd rented specifically to avoid prying eyes. When I arrived, Burke was already there, his suit rumpled and his face drawn. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, but his eyes were sharp, focused. "We've got enough to bring them down," he said without preamble, spreading a series of documents across the table. "Ethan, Amelia, and everyone they've roped into their scheme. We've got phone records, bank transfers, witness statements. It's airtight." I scanned the papers, a sense of satisfaction settling over me. We were close, so close I could almost taste it. Amelia's carefully constructed house of cards was about to come crashing down, and this time, there would be no escape. "I've also tightened security at your offices," Burke continued. "We've planted surveillance equipment, tapped into the phones of everyone involved. If they so much as whisper about their plans, we'll know about it." I nodded, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on me. "What about Amelia?" "She's planning to leave the country, and if she gets out, we'll lose her." Burke smiled, a cold, calculated expression that told me he'd anticipated this. "We've alerted the authorities at every major port, airport, and train station. If she tries to run, we'll catch her. And if she manages to slip past them, I've got contacts in Madrid who are ready to intercept her. She won't get far." As we discussed the final details, I felt a surge of determination. This was it, the culmination of everything we'd been working toward. Amelia's betrayal had cost me dearly, but now I was about to take back what was mine. I would bring her down, expose her lies, and reclaim the empire she had tried to destroy. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Noah and I monitored every move within the company, tracing the actions of those who had betrayed me, piecing together the final threads of Amelia's web. We moved with precision, each step calculated, each move deliberate. And with every passing hour, we closed in on our targets. Amelia had underestimated me. She'd thought she could manipulate, deceive, and then slip away without consequence. But she hadn't counted on Noah's resolve or Burke's relentless pursuit of justice. She hadn't counted on me, the man who had built this empire and who would stop at nothing to defend it. As I prepared for the final confrontation, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. I was ready to face whatever lay ahead, ready to see this through to the end. Amelia and Ethan had started this, but I would finish it. And when the dust finally settled, they would both know what it meant to cross Jackson Hayes. I finally had it all, the evidence, the connections, the tangled threads of deceit unraveled and laid bare before me. I'd spent weeks clawing through every sordid detail of Amelia's betrayal, dissecting each layer of Ethan's schemes, and now, standing on the precipice, I found myself wrestling with a question I hadn't expected to face. Was I really prepared to destroy her? Amelia Hayes, my wife, my partner, the woman I had once trusted implicitly, was about to face the full brunt of my wrath. But as the weight of my discovery settled over me, I found myself gripped by something akin to hesitation. She was the woman I had built my life with, after all. I had once seen a future in her eyes, a reflection of my ambitions and dreams. And yet, here we were, adversaries locked in a battle that would leave no victors. Noah and I were holed up in a rented office on the outskirts of New York, surrounded by stacks of evidence. Every photograph, every bank transfer, every phone call Amelia had made was cataloged and mapped out on the wall before us. Detective Burke had pulled some strings to ensure that everything was in place, ready for the final strike. But something gnawed at me, a flicker of doubt that refused to be snuffed out. As I stared at a recent photograph of Amelia, taken just days ago outside an exclusive bank in Zurich, I felt the old memories rise unbidden. We'd met in this very city, where she had been a fresh-faced marketing director for a luxury brand. She was ambitious, like me, and we'd clicked instantly, drawn together by a mutual drive to conquer the world. But now, the woman I saw in the photo was a stranger, cold, calculating, and entrenched in a life I could barely comprehend. Burke, who had been monitoring Amelia's movements, approached with an update. "She's been planning this for years, Jackson," he said, pointing to a series of bank transactions on the screen. "It looks like it started with a debt, one that led her straight to Ethan Rivera. He didn't just pull her into his world. She walked in willingly, desperate for an escape from her own mess, a debt." The word hung in the air like a specter. I leaned forward, scrutinizing the documents that detailed her financial history. It was all there. She'd been under massive financial strain, but I had never known. She'd hidden it well, masking her desperation behind the facade of a perfect life. Ethan had taken advantage of her vulnerability, drawn her into his orbit, and used her as a pawn in his schemes. But why hadn't she told me? Why had she chosen this path over the trust we'd built? I didn't have time to ponder that question long. I had a meeting scheduled with Amelia. I'd arranged for it at an art gallery in Chelsea, a place she and I had once frequented during our early days together, back when life was simpler. It was a fitting location for the final act of our tangled story. I arrived early, taking in the familiar surroundings with a pang of nostalgia. The gallery was almost empty, save for a few patrons wandering amidst the abstract pieces that lined the walls. I could feel the tension building, a knot of anticipation tightening in my chest as I waited. And then, she appeared. Amelia walked in, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her posture confident but her eyes wary. She looked stunning, as always, dressed in a sleek black coat that hugged her figure, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. But there was something different about her, a hardness, a glint of steel that hadn't been there before. "Jackson," she greeted, her voice steady, a hint of cool detachment in her tone. Why here? What's this all about? I took a deep breath, gesturing toward a quiet corner where we could speak without interruptions. We need to talk, Amelia. About everything. She nodded, following me to the corner. I watched her carefully, noting the slight tension in her jaw, the way her hands gripped the strap of her purse. She was on edge, and she had every reason to be. I wasn't about to make this easy for her. I know about the money, Amelia. I know about Ethan, the offshore accounts, the fake passports. I know everything. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of fear cross her face, but she masked it quickly, her expression hardening. You don't understand, Jackson. You don't know the whole story. Then tell me, I demanded, my voice barely a whisper. Tell me why you chose to betray me. Why you chose him over everything we built together. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. When she spoke, her voice was laced with a bitterness I hadn't expected. You think I had a choice? Ethan found me when I was at my lowest, Jackson. I owed a debt, one that I could never repay. It started small, just a few bad investments, a few too many risks. But before I knew it, I was in over my head. Ethan offered me a way out, and I took it. A way out. I repeated, my mind racing. You could have come to me. I would have helped you. She laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed in the empty gallery. You? Help me? You were so consumed with your empire, so obsessed with your skyscrapers and your power, that you barely even saw me. I was just another accessory, another piece of your collection. Her words cut deeper than I'd expected, but I forced myself to stay composed. So you decided to throw in with Ethan? To become his puppet? I did what I had to do, she replied, her voice taut with emotion. Ethan wasn't just a lifeline. He was a way to escape from a life where I'd lost myself. I wasn't the perfect wife, Jackson, and I'm not ashamed of that anymore. She met my gaze, her eyes flashing with a mixture of defiance and regret. But Ethan isn't who you think he is, either. He's not just some criminal. He's ruthless, manipulative, and he'll destroy anyone who stands in his way, including you. Then why help him? I asked, frustration boiling over. Why throw everything away for a man like that? Because I was desperate, she cried, her voice cracking. I didn't know how else to escape the mess I'd created. He made me feel like I had control, like I was powerful. But now I see what he really is. Her confession hung in the air, a raw and painful truth that neither of us could escape. But I wasn't done yet. There was one more piece of the puzzle I needed to understand. And what about my company, Amelia? The people you roped into your schemes, the money you siphoned off? Was that all part of your plan, too? She looked away, a shadow of guilt crossing her face. That wasn't supposed to happen. I only needed enough to cover my debts, but Ethan pushed for more. He saw an opportunity, and he took it. I tried to stop him, Jackson, but by then, it was too late. I was in too deep. I took a step back, feeling the weight of her words settle over me like a shroud. I'd wanted answers, and now I had them, but they brought no comfort, no closure. Only a hollow sense of betrayal that I wasn't sure I could ever shake. And then, as if summoned by our very words, Ethan Rivera appeared. He strolled into the gallery, his presence an unsettling contrast to the quiet, refined atmosphere. He was dressed impeccably, as always, with an air of arrogance that set my teeth on edge. Well, isn't this a touching reunion? He drawled, his gaze flicking between Amelia and me. I must say, Jackson, I didn't expect you to figure it all out quite so quickly. I squared my shoulders, meeting his gaze head-on. I know everything, Rivera. I know about the fraud, the laundering, the entire operation. It's over. He chuckled, unfazed. You think you've won? This little empire you've built means nothing to me. I could burn it to the ground and walk away without a second thought. But you won't, I replied, a steely edge to my voice. Because you're nothing without your schemes, without people like Amelia to do your dirty work. You're a parasite, feeding off the ambition of others. And now, you've run out of hosts. For the first time, I saw a flash of anger in his eyes. He took a step forward, his posture menacing, but I held my ground. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Hayes," he hissed. "I've taken down bigger men than you, and I've dealt with men far worse than you." I shot back, my resolve unwavering. "This ends now, Rivera. I've got enough evidence to bury you, and I won't stop until you're rotting in a cell." He sneered, his confidence crumbling. Amelia, caught between us, looked at him with something akin to contempt. In that moment, I realized that whatever hold he'd had over her was gone. She'd seen him for what he truly was, a man without loyalty, without honor, a predator who had preyed on her weakness. As the confrontation came to a close, I felt a strange sense of finality wash over me. Amelia's betrayal had cut deep, but it was Ethan who had pulled the strings, who had orchestrated the entire charade. And now, with Burke's team waiting outside, he would finally face justice. Amelia turned to me, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, Jackson," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I made mistakes. I let myself be consumed by things I didn't understand. But you were always stronger than me." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. The love I'd once felt for her had been twisted into something unrecognizable, a shadow of what it had been. But as she walked away, escorted by Burke's men, I felt a glimmer of closure. The life we'd shared was over, but I still had a future, one I would rebuild, brick by brick, from the ashes of the empire she had nearly destroyed. And as for Ethan, he would face the consequences of his actions. I'd see to that personally. This was the end of their game, but for me, it was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would stand alone, stronger, and more determined than ever to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The plan was almost too perfect. Every detail had been calculated, every move meticulously plotted. Amelia and Ethan had underestimated me, just as they had underestimated the power of the truth. I had spent the last few weeks carefully aligning all the pieces, waiting for the moment when I could pull the strings and watch their entire world crumble. It was a brisk morning in New York, the air thick with anticipation as I stood in the courtroom, facing the people who had tried to dismantle everything I'd built. There were 7 of them in total, each with a role in the conspiracy that had almost brought my company to its knees. Daniel Kerrigan, the CFO I'd once trusted implicitly, sat stone-faced in the first row. Beside him was Linda Thompson, the head of international development who had funneled funds through Paris and back into Ethan's accounts. And then there were the others: Kyle Benson, head of marketing; Jessica Ramirez, my financial advisor; Robert Ellis, a longtime board member; and 2 junior executives, Marcus Lloyd and Sarah Chun, who had unwittingly become entangled in Amelia's schemes. Burke had pulled through in ways I hadn't imagined possible. He tracked their movements, their conversations, their every transaction, and now they all sat here, caught in a web of their own making. Each of them would be facing serious time. Money laundering, fraud, embezzlement, charges that would see them shipped off to some of the toughest federal prisons in the country. They'd probably end up in facilities like FCI Danbury or even FCI Fort Dix, places designed for the high-profile white-collar criminals who thought they could outsmart the system. Amelia and Ethan, however, were a different matter. Their trial was a spectacle all its own, with press, cameras, and a public eager to see them fall. They stood before Judge Lawrence Bennett, a seasoned man with sharp eyes and a reputation for being unyielding. The prosecutor, a woman named Clara Torres, was as formidable as she was eloquent. She presented the case with surgical precision, dissecting their crimes for the jury and laying bare the extent of their betrayal. Amelia sat beside Ethan, her face a mask of indifference, but I knew better. I could see the cracks in her armor, the way her hands clenched just a little too tightly in her lap, the flicker of fear in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. Ethan, on the other hand, looked as arrogant as ever, his confidence unshaken despite the mountain of evidence against him. But it wouldn't last. The trial spanned 2 weeks, with witness testimonies, forensic accountants, and a parade of evidence that painted a damning picture. Amelia and Ethan's attorney, a slick man named Peter Wallace, tried to spin it, to twist the facts into something that resembled innocence. But it was no use. The jury saw through his tactics, and after only 3 hours of deliberation, they returned with their verdicts: Guilty on all counts. Judge Bennett leaned forward, his voice steely as he handed down the sentences. Amelia Hayes, for your role in orchestrating this conspiracy, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. Ethan Rivera, for your involvement in money laundering, fraud, and racketeering, you will serve 35 years. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the finality of it settling over the crowd like a dark shroud. Amelia cast one last glance in my direction, a fleeting look of regret, perhaps, or maybe defiance. But it didn't matter. She was gone, along with Ethan, and they would both be locked away, far removed from the empire they had tried to steal from me. As I walked out of the courthouse, the cold air hit my face, and I felt a strange sense of freedom. I had done it. I had reclaimed my life, my company, and my reputation. There was no trace left of the betrayal, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. And now, it was time to rebuild, to start anew. That evening, I returned to my office, the top floor of my skyscraper, my sanctuary. The city lay stretched out before me, the lights twinkling like stars against the night sky. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, Macallan fine and rare, a bottle I'd been saving for a moment like this. I sank into my leather armchair, savoring the rich, smoky warmth as it slid down my throat, and allowed myself to relax, truly relax, for the first time in months. Noah entered, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. He'd been instrumental in all of this, a loyal friend and ally who had stood by me even when the odds seemed insurmountable. He glanced at the door and gave a nod. "You have a visitor," he said, a slight smirk playing at the corner of his lips. Isabella Stone. I wasn't entirely surprised. Isabella had her own way of appearing when least expected, and tonight was no exception. She stepped into the office, a vision of elegance and power. She wore a black Givenchy dress that hugged her curves in all the right places, the kind of dress that seemed to shimmer with each movement, catching the light just so. Her dark hair was swept back, revealing a diamond necklace that sparkled like ice against her skin. "Jackson," she greeted, her voice smooth, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "I see you're celebrating." I gestured to the glass in my hand, pouring another for her. "It's been a long time coming," I replied, handing her the whiskey. She took it, raising the glass in a silent toast before taking a sip. "You've certainly made quite a spectacle," she said, settling into the chair opposite me. "But I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. You've always had a flair for the dramatic." We sat there in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city below, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The whiskey warmed my blood, a slow, spreading heat that seemed to dissolve the tension I hadn't realized I was holding. Isabella was watching me, her gaze steady, and I felt a pull, an undeniable attraction that had been there from the start. The world outside seemed to fade as I moved closer to her, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. Her perfume filled the air, a heady blend of jasmine and something darker, something that hinted at mystery and danger. I reached for her, my hand brushing against her cheek, and she leaned into the touch, her eyes half closed as if savoring the moment. We moved together, an unspoken understanding passing between us as I drew her close, our bodies intertwining like we had been waiting for this moment all along. Her skin was warm beneath my hands, her breath a whisper against my neck as we sank into the plush leather of the sofa. Time seemed to stop, the world narrowing down to the two of us, the soft glow of the city lights our only witness. We made love with a kind of intensity that felt both raw and intimate, a connection that went beyond words. Her fingers traced patterns along my back, her body pressing against mine, and for a moment, everything else fell away. There was no past, no future, only the present, the heat between us, the rhythm of our hearts beating in sync. Afterwards, we lay there, tangled together on the sofa, the remnants of our passion lingering in the air. Isabella's head rested on my chest, her dark hair spilling over my shoulder, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in a long time. But Isabella, ever the enigma, had more to say. She looked up at me, her gaze thoughtful, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "You know, Jackson," she began, tracing a finger along my arm, "there's something I need from you. I arched an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. And what might that be? She sat up, the shimmer of her dress catching the light as she moved. A favor, she said simply, her eyes locking onto mine. There's someone I need you to keep an eye on. A powerful figure, well-connected, and someone who has information I need. I could see it in her eyes, the thrill of the chase, the allure of the unknown. She was offering me another adventure, a new challenge to sink my teeth into. And as I sat there, holding her gaze, I knew I was ready. Ready to step into the unknown, to face whatever lay ahead, side by side with this woman who had become as much a part of my life as the city itself. Isabella's smile deepened, her eyes flashing with mischief as she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine in a final, lingering kiss. If you like this story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.